The town square bustled with tourists, the warm afternoon sun casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. People strolled past historic war memorials, cameras flashing, their voices a steady hum of excitement. Some paused to read plaques, to take in the solemnity of the names carved in stone, but most just walked on, too caught up in their own world to care. At the heart of it all, standing still amidst the movement, was Walt Grayson, 72 years old, broad-shouldered despite his age, with a Marine Corps hat pulled low over his sharp blue eyes. He stood with his hands in his worn leather jacket, gazing at a bronze statue of soldiers frozen in battle. His posture was straight as a rifle. To any passerby, he looked like just another old man remembering the past. But Walt wasn't remembering. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. He was counting how many men from his old unit were still alive, counting how many had their names etched into cold stone instead of warm flesh. He exhaled slowly, his breath steady, controlled. He didn't come here for attention. He didn't come here for thanks. He came because he owed them this. Then came the voice. Yo, check this guy out. Dude's standing like he's about to give orders to the whole square. The words were sharp, cocky, too loud. Walt knew the type before he even turned around. A younger man, maybe late 20s, tall, blonde, dressed in designer clothes that looked more expensive than practical. He held a camera in one hand, his phone in the other, smirking at the lens like this was all some kind of joke. Chad Wilkins. A name Walt didn't know, but one that thousands, maybe millions of people online did. A travel vlogger. A social media personality. The kind of person who existed to be watched. And today? Today he had chosen the wrong person to film. Walt didn't move, didn't even acknowledge him. Chad's grin widened as he turned toward the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Messing with Strangers. Today's target, a real-life war hero. His friend, another kid, shorter, holding a second camera, chuckled behind him. Oh man, Chad continued, shaking his head. This guy is just full-on war movie mode. Look at him. I swear he's about to start barking orders any second. The square was still moving, but people were starting to notice. Tourists slowed their steps, eyes flicking between the loud young man with the camera and the old soldier who still hadn't reacted. That only made Chad push harder. He stepped closer, tilting his camera toward Walt's face. Come on, Grandpa, he laughed. Tell us a war story. What was it like fighting the dinosaurs back in the day? His friend snickered. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others pulled out their phones, sensing that something was about to happen. But Walt still didn't move, and that made Chad reckless. Oh, I get it, Chad smirked, circling him now, like a predator that didn't realize it was the prey. You're doing the whole strong, silent thing. Real tough. That's cute. Then he did it. He reached out and smacked Walt's hat clean off his head. The Marine Corps cap hit the ground, rolling onto the cobblestones. And the world stopped. The laughter died. The movement in the square slowed, conversations fading into an almost unnatural silence. The sound of the hat hitting stone was louder than anything Chad had said. Someone in the crowd muttered, "Oh, hell no." Walt took a slow breath, and for the first time, he moved. He bent down, carefully, picking up his cap, dusting it off like it was something sacred. Because it was. When he straightened, he finally turned and locked eyes with Chad. The younger man's smirk was still there, but weaker now. He was still filming, still playing to the camera, but the energy had shifted. The people watching knew it. Chad knew it, and Walt knew it. The old Marine tilted his head slightly, studying him. Then, his voice. Calm, steady, unshaken, broke the silence. Son, you just made the worst mistake of your life. A ripple went through the crowd. Chad scoffed, stepping back, trying to laugh it off. Oh, come on, Grandpa. It's a joke. Walt didn't blink. He just took one slow step forward, and Chad stepped back. He didn't even realize he did it. His body reacted before his brain did, because suddenly he wasn't in control anymore. The square was quiet now. Too quiet. Tell me something, Walt said, his voice low, even. You ever been in a real fight, kid? Chad snorted, but it sounded forced. What, you want to fight me? No. Walt took another step forward. I'm asking if you've ever fought for something that mattered. Chad opened his mouth, closed it. Walt tilted his head. You ever hold a dying man in your arms? Ever hear someone beg for their mother with their last breath? Chad froze. The crowd wasn't watching Chad anymore. They were watching Walt, listening, respecting. You think you're funny, Walt said, his voice like iron. You think this is a joke. Chad's hands twitched at his sides. Walt's eyes didn't waver. I don't care about your cameras. I don't care about your followers. But I care about this hat. He lifted it slightly. Because the men who wore this before me, they didn't get to grow old. Chad's throat bobbed. He looked at the camera, at his friend, but no one was laughing anymore. No one was on his side. Walt took another step. Now so close, Chad had no choice but to look him in the eye. You think disrespect makes you powerful. It doesn't. It makes you small. Chad swallowed, his face turning pale. And then, without another word, Walt turned his back on him. Because the worst thing you can do to a man desperate for attention is refuse to give it to him. The crowd was still silent. Chad was motionless. And for the first time in his life, he realized he had lost. Chad stood frozen, his entire body locked in place as Walt turned his back and walked away. The weight of the moment crashed down on him in ways he hadn't expected. He had spent years making a name for himself by pushing the limits, by getting reactions, by treating life as nothing more than content for his followers. But this wasn't how it was supposed to go. The cameras were still rolling. His friend still had his phone up, but his expression had shifted from amusement to unease. The crowd wasn't laughing. No one was on Chad's side anymore. He could feel it, like the air had been sucked out of the space around him, leaving only the thick, suffocating realization that he was completely alone. He swallowed hard, trying to gather himself, trying to summon some kind of witty remark to take back control. He forced a smirk, but it didn't land. His voice cracked slightly when he spoke. Damn, guess someone forgot their morning coffee. Nothing, not a single chuckle. He exhaled sharply, turning toward his friend, looking for support. But the guy was already lowering his phone. His face was tense, his stance stiff, like he didn't want to be standing next to Chad anymore. Chad's stomach twisted. The realization settled in slowly at first, then all at once. He had messed up, badly. His brand, his reputation, his entire online persona was built on the idea that he was untouchable, that he was the guy who could say whatever he wanted, do whatever he wanted, and people would love him for it. But right now, he felt like a clown who had just tripped in front of an audience that wasn't laughing anymore. A few more seconds passed in silence, and then the real damage began. A middle-aged man in the crowd, someone who had been standing nearby the entire time, let out a disgusted scoff. Unbelievable, he muttered, shaking his head as he turned and walked away. A woman nearby crossed her arms. Some people have no respect, she said under her breath, but loud enough for Chad to hear. And then another voice, one that hit harder than any of them. You're pathetic. Chad's eyes snapped toward the sound. A young man, maybe mid-30s, wearing a tattered army jacket, staring at him with pure disappointment. The guy didn't even look angry. Just done. Chad swallowed again, his throat dry. People were leaving. They were walking away from him. Not just physically, in every way. The crowd had gathered expecting a joke, a viral moment. But what they got was an embarrassment. The weight of it all was suffocating. And then his phone buzzed. He looked down at his screen, desperate for something. A distraction, an escape. But what he saw made his stomach drop. His live-stream chat. Thousands of viewers had been watching, commenting. But it wasn't praise. It wasn't the usual flood of laughing emojis and excitement. Dude, that was messed up. Not cool, bro. Unsubbed. LMAO, he just walked away like you don't even exist. I used to think you were funny. Now you're just an ass. Chad's hands went cold. He scrolled faster, looking for something positive, something to tell him that this was just a fluke, that people were still on his side. But there was nothing. His brand was built on being untouchable, on always having control of the moment. But right now, the moment controlled him. His breathing grew shallow, his chest tight. His hands trembled slightly as he shoved his phone back into his pocket, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut, the quiet realization that he had just ruined everything. His friend shifted uncomfortably beside him. Man, maybe we should just—" "Shut up!" Chad snapped, his voice sharper than intended. His friend recoiled slightly, then shook his head and stepped away. "Whatever, dude," he muttered, slipping his phone into his hoodie and disappearing into the thinning crowd. And just like that, Chad was alone. For the first time in years, he had nothing to say, nothing to post, nothing to hide behind. He stood in the square, his body rigid, his mind racing. He had lost. Not just the moment, not just the crowd, everything. And Walt was already gone, because Walt never needed to stay. The lesson had already been taught, the damage had already been done. And now Chad was the one left picking up the pieces. The night air felt heavier than usual as Chad sat alone on a bench near the war memorial, his hands clasped together, his phone burning a hole in his pocket. He hadn't checked his notifications in over an hour, which was probably a new record for him. He knew what would be waiting for him if he did. The comments, the backlash, the subscribers jumping ship, the digital wreckage of his brand falling apart in real time. He exhaled sharply, rubbing his face with both hands. His fingers trembled slightly. The adrenaline from earlier had long since worn off, leaving only a hollow, sinking feeling in his gut. His mind was still replaying the moment Walt had turned his back on him. Not yelling, not threatening, just dismissing him, like he wasn't even worth the effort. That was what stung the most. For years, Chad had lived off of reactions. Everything he did, every prank, every so-called social experiment, it was all about control. He dictated the moment, he made the rules. But today, he had been nothing. He leaned back against the cold wood of the bench, staring up at the darkening sky. The hum of distant traffic filled the silence around him, but it didn't distract him from the growing pit in his stomach. He had lost followers before. People got offended. People moved on. It was part of the game. But this wasn't just people unfollowing him. This was people seeing him for what he really was, a fraud, a joke, a man who had spent his entire life mocking things he didn't understand. His fingers twitched as he finally pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen lit up, and the first thing he saw was a notification from one of his biggest sponsors. Canceled. His stomach dropped. He scrolled down. Another email, another brand pulling out. This wasn't just online drama anymore. This was his entire career crumbling beneath him. The reality of it hit him like a truck. His mind raced. He needed to fix this. He needed to do something. Maybe he could spin it, make a video addressing it, crack some self-deprecating joke to soften the blow. Maybe he could. His thumb hovered over the camera app. Then he stopped, because for the first time, he didn't want to film. He didn't want to talk to a camera, didn't want to perform, didn't want to fake his way out of another situation. He just wanted to disappear. He gritted his teeth, tossing his phone onto the bench beside him. Damn it. Not so funny now, is it? Chad's entire body tensed. The voice was familiar, steady, unshaken. He turned his head slowly, and there was Walt. The old Marine stood a few feet away, hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket, watching him with the same calm, unreadable gaze. Chad's chest tightened. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel, as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. He hadn't even heard him approach. Walt exhaled, stepping closer. You ever notice how quiet the world gets when you finally start listening? Chad swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. His fingers were still shaking. I don't need a damn lecture. Walt smirked. Then you probably shouldn't have picked a fight with a Marine in front of a crowd. Chad let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. Yeah, well, I've made plenty of mistakes before. This one just happens to be trending. Walt studied him for a moment, then gestured to the empty space beside Chad. Mind if I sit? Chad blinked, caught off guard. He had expected Walt to rub it in, to give him some long-winded speech about respect and consequences. But this wasn't what he expected. He hesitated before nodding. Walt lowered himself onto the bench, letting out a slow sigh as he leaned back. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was different. Chad exhaled. "I don't get it." Walt raised an eyebrow. "What?" Chad gestured vaguely toward him. You. Why the hell are you even talking to me? You won, man. You put me in my place. The internet's tearing me apart. You don't need to sit here and make sure I got the message." Walt chuckled, shaking his head. "Kid, you think I give a damn about the internet?" Chad scoffed. "Pretty sure it gives a damn about you." Walt shrugged. "The internet moves fast. They'll find something else to be mad about by next week. But you," he turned to Chad, his expression serious now, "you're the one who has to sit with this." Chad felt his throat tighten. Walt leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You know, when I was your age, I thought I had everything figured out. Thought I knew what mattered. Turns out, I didn't know a damn thing." Chad let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, at least you had a real excuse. You were out there fighting wars. I was just out here fighting for attention." Walt nodded slowly. "And look where it got you." Chad clenched his jaw. "Yeah, thanks for the reminder." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Walt sighed. "You still don't get it, do you?" Chad frowned. "Get what?" Walt turned to him, his voice calm, steady. "You're not the villain in your own story, kid. You're just lost." Chad's breath caught. The words hit harder than he expected. He had spent his entire life playing a character. But now he wasn't sure who the hell he actually was. Walt stretched, standing up. "I don't expect you to change overnight, but I do expect you to think about what kind of man you want to be." Chad swallowed hard. "And what if I don't know?" Walt gave him a long look, then smirked. "Then it's time you start figuring it out." Chad watched as the old Marine turned and walked away, disappearing into the quiet streets of the square. For the first time in his life, Chad Wilkins wasn't looking at his phone. For the first time, he was looking at himself. Chad sat there long after Walt had walked away. The night was settling in, the hum of the city growing quieter as tourists filtered out of the square, leaving only the occasional footsteps of late stragglers and the distant wail of a siren in the background. The glow from the streetlights cast long shadows across the war memorial, stretching across the cobblestone like ghostly reminders of what once was. His phone lay face down on the bench beside him, the screen dark, the weight of it heavier than ever. He didn't want to look at it. For the first time in his life, he didn't care about what people were saying. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. His body still hummed with leftover adrenaline, but it wasn't the rush he usually felt when his videos went viral. This was different. This was defeat. And not the kind that could be fixed with a quick joke or a clever edit. His whole life, he had always been the one in control. Every stunt, every prank, every video, it had all been carefully designed to keep him on top, to keep people watching. But today he wasn't in control. He had walked into that square thinking he could turn Walt into just another nameless face in his content machine. Another clip for the highlight reel. Another moment to boost his numbers. Instead, he had been the one turned into a lesson. And the worst part? He deserved it. The thought made his stomach twist, his fingers twitching against his knee. His entire brand, his entire identity. It was all built on pushing the line, making people uncomfortable, treating life like a stage and everyone else like a prop. And now, for the first time, he had been forced to see himself from the outside. It wasn't a good look. The comments, the backlash, the people walking away, it had all hit him hard. But it wasn't just the internet. It was Walt. The old man's words had cut through him like a knife, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. You think disrespect makes you powerful. It doesn't. It makes you small. That line wouldn't leave his head, because that was the thing that scared him the most. What if he was small? What if all of this, all the videos, the followers, the clout, was just an illusion? What if, when it all faded, there was nothing real underneath? His chest felt tight. For the first time, he felt afraid. Not of losing followers, not of being canceled, but of being nothing. He reached for his phone, hesitating before flipping it over. The screen lit up instantly, hundreds of notifications. The messages kept rolling in, one after the other, each one cutting a little deeper. Man, I used to like you, now I just feel bad for you. Lost all respect, dude. You messed with the wrong guy. Not everything is content. Grow up. This was embarrassing to watch. Walt didn't even have to hit you. He just let you destroy yourself. Chad swallowed hard, his pulse thudding in his ears. He scrolled down, scanning the wave of disappointment, of anger. It was overwhelming. And then he saw it. A single comment buried among the chaos. A name that made his blood run cold. Nathan Wilkins, his father. He hesitated before clicking on the message, his chest tightening. He hadn't spoken to his father in almost a year. Their last conversation had ended in a fight. Another one of Chad's usual blow-ups. Another excuse to push people away before they could do it to him first. But the message was short. We need to talk. Call me. His fingers twitched. His father never texted him, never reached out first. And now, suddenly he wanted to talk? Chad exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He knew what this was about. His father had served too, not in the same era as Walt, but in a different war, a different battlefield. And Chad had spent his whole life ignoring that part of him, acting like it didn't matter, like his father's experiences, his sacrifices, his stories, like they were all just background noise. But now he understood why his father had never laughed at his jokes, why his father had always looked at him with that mix of disappointment and exhaustion. Because Chad had spent years mocking things he never took the time to understand. He squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw tightening. He could ignore the internet, he could ignore the comments, but he couldn't ignore this. Not anymore. His thumb hovered over the call button. For a long moment, he just stared at it, his heart hammering. Then, finally, he pressed it. The phone rang. Once, twice, then a deep, familiar voice answered, "Chad." He exhaled, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have a comeback. Just silence. Then, finally, he spoke. "Hey, Dad."